Hello, hello, American literature fans. So, I am now going to talk to you about early 20th century prose and also about a boat, as they say in Canada. Something else. What else was it? I done forgot. Oh, yeah, the introduction into modernism. So, let's talk about the early 20th century prose first. And you can follow along with me by clicking on content and then course documents and then early 20th century prose overview. So here's just some introduction, some basic background info that will be helpful. So prose, which is fiction and nonfiction of the American colonies in the United States, written in the English language from like 1600 to now, really captures America's journey, its quest to understand and define itself. And from the beginning, we were unique in the diversity of our inhabitants. Over time, they arrived from all parts of the world. They continue to do that. So English quickly became the language of America. Um, However, regional and ethnic dialects have enlivened and enriched our literature almost from the very start. So today, American prose encompasses this wide variety of traditions, of voices that share this common context, the geographical region now known as the U.S. And Native American literatures, which were largely oral at the time of colonial settlement, they weren't written, stand apart as a separate tradition that is itself strong and varied. And if you ever get a chance to take a class in Native American Lit, do it. I did that in I think I was in undergrad school. Absolutely loved it. So for the first 200 years, American prose reflected the settlement, the growth of the colonies, largely through histories, religious writings, expedition and travel narratives back at the beginning. And biography played an important role as well, especially in our search for native heroes. Because if you think about it, we're this brand new land and we don't have any heroes yet, right, in the beginning. Fiction only appeared after the colonies gained independence from Great Britain, when this clamor for a uniquely American sort of literature brought forth novels based on events in our past. And obviously we didn't have much of a past at that point, but we had this flowering then of writing in the mid 1800s, and that is when, as a young nation, we found our own unique sort of voice. And by then fiction had become the dominant literary genre in America. But in the 20th century, the 1900s, and remember, don't get your centuries confused, the 1900s were the 20th century, American lit took its place on the world stage and started to really exert influence on the literature of other nations. So that's just a bit of background. Now I want to talk about modernism, and here in just a minute I'm going to get into it more deeply. But during the 20th century, the 1900s, a communications revolution just exploded, right? So all of a sudden we had radio, we had television, we had the ability to get on a plane and travel across the world fairly quickly. And so it brought the whole world into view and eventually right into our living rooms. I remember hearing my parents, they were older when I was born, they were 40 when I was born. But I remember them talking about life before television and how people would sit out on their front porches a lot more, and they would talk to each other, and there was more of a sense of community. But once television came along, not so much radio, but television, people were sort of locked in their own living rooms and not talking to their neighbors. And then eventually everyone had a TV in their bedrooms, and individuals were locked away from their own immediate families. So these new forms of communication competed with books, that before had been the main source of amusement and enlightenment and knowledge. Before television and radio, you just had books, right? So new forms of communication, new modes of transportation made our society increasingly mobile and made us familiar with more regions of our own country as well as the rest of the world. And literary voices then from the farthest corners could reach a national audience. And at the same time, American writers, especially writers of fiction, started to influence, as I said, the world lit. So the 20th century saw the emergence of a genre called modernism. And modernism, here's what you need to remember because it's going to haunt you on a quiz and probably the final. Modernism responded to the world's increasing complexity by asserting the idea that the individual, one person, had the potential to achieve now a broader perspective than that would be offered by any one society or its history. So now all of a sudden, the world is brought into my living room. And I'm able to broaden my perspective. I'm able to see what's going on across the globe. And I'm not just restricted to thinking about my own little corner of the world. So that's kind of good and it's kind of bad, right? Because with World War II, we then saw that one person might have the ability to make the decision to drop a bomb. And that was much scarier. Realism and naturalism and regionalism, so that local color realism, were still viable modes of expression in literature, but they began to reflect how increasingly complicated life in the 20th century was becoming, because all of this ease, kind of also created complexities. Immigration and industrialization led to increasing urbanization, so more and more and more people coming into the big cities, and thus class stratification. The very rich, the very poor, the middle class. And at the beginning of the 19th century, American authors were struggling just to convince the rest of the world that we even had a history. But by the 20th century, American authors, like the European authors, had to grapple with more than enough history. So in the 1900s, we had this really cool genre of realism called psychological realism. And Henry James was a key figure in our transition in American Lit from the 1800s into the 1900s. So more of his novels were actually published before 1900, before the turn of the 20th century, than after. But his style, which was characterized by psychological rather than physical realism, so what's going on in the mind rather than what's going on out in the world. And his themes seemed really far removed from a lot of the 19th century American Lit. So his use of American and European subject matter and perspectives, as well as his sense of the complexities of both individual and cultural history, made him a modernist and a writer that the 20th century could claim as one of its literary representatives. And then Edith Wharton, whose work show the influence of James, was another key turn of the century figure. And we're not reading these writers, but if you get a chance to, they're awesome. A lot of her novels took place among the wealthy and the elite in New York City, and they focus on the restrictions imposed on people who are wealthy, right, by social definition and convention. So we don't often think of wealthy people as having a real tough time in life, but Wharton brought the reality of their situations alive in her writing, because they face a whole set of problems that most of us don't ever encounter. So the idea that maybe someone wants to be your friend for your money, not because they really want to be your friend. And maybe there are certain social expectations you have to live up to as one of the elite and the wealthy that you just really don't care anything about, but you feel that you must take on this role. So that was interesting. There's also social realism and naturalism. So James and Wharton were examining this complex psychology of the wealthy. Other writers were turning to the psychological and physical reality of the working class. And their ranks were continuing to swell with high rates of immigration in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And a lot of American authors, I should say not a lot, several of the authors known as social realists look at working conditions, often for the purpose of reforming them. And so, for example, the best example I can think of here is in 1906, Upton Sinclair published his novel, The Jungle. And that exposed the horrible, unsanitary, miserable working conditions in the stockyards of Chicago. And interestingly, that book led to an investigation by the federal government and the subsequent passage of pure food laws. So remember how we've said that sometimes literature can be the catalyst for change and for the making of history. So in this case, Sinclair's book really brought about amazing reforms. So as the popularity of social realism would imply, the reading audience of Americans was changing as the social and economic realities were changing, and immigrant populations added a lot of variety to 20th century American fiction. So we had this period of disillusionment and cynicism following World War I and that first pandemic in 1918 that you probably heard about. And it found expression in the writings of a group of Americans who were actually living in Paris. And they became known as the Lost Generation. So when you think of the 1920s, you think of the Roaring Twenties, right? And you think of, all of this extravagance and all of that. But actually, there was also a lot of cynicism and disillusionment. So the group never formed a cohesive movement, but they all shared this bitterness about the war and this sense of rootlessness and this dissatisfaction with America and American society. And the most influential of that generation were people like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Thornton Wilder, McLeish and Crane. And that term, lost generation, was first used by Gertrude Stein in her preface to Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, to sort of characterize Hemingway and his expat friends who were living in Paris and were just kind of disgusted with the U.S. in general. So that's the lost generation. I won't, quiz you about that or anything. Next, we had the 1930s, the Great Depression. So that glitter and excess of the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, ended with the 1929 stock market crash. And that ushered in the so-called angry decade of the 1930s, the Great Depression. And I've heard my father talk about it. He said that in Chattanooga, Tennessee, these soup lines extended for blocks and blocks and blocks. And that people, as the banks just had to close up their doors, they told people, look, just stay in your house. You can't make your house payment. We're all, going out of business anyway. Just stay in your house. And a lot of the wealthy and elite who lost everything literally jumped from the skyscrapers in New York to their deaths the day of the stock market crash. So it was a terrible time. A lot of the novels echoed the despair of that time. But during the Depression, here's sort of a bright point. A federal agency that was first known as the Works Progress Administration and later as the Works Progress or Projects Administration, the WPA, was created by President Roosevelt to put unemployed Americans to work on public projects. And one arm of the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, was the FWP, the Federal Writers Project. And it ran from 1935 to 1941. And it employed writers to produce travel guides, local history, nature studies, and other books. And it not only produced all this fascinating material, but it provided training for some incredible writers, including Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and also including Zora Neale Hurston, who is one of my favorites. And Wright's Native Son explores the psychological pressures that drive a young urban black man to violence. It established Wright as a leading African American writer of the 40s, a key influence on the younger writers, including Baldwin. And Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain depicts Harlem in the 30s. Ellison's The Invisible Man is often cited as one of the greatest American novels of the 20th century. And in that piece, an unnamed young black man's searching for his place in the world. So Ellison confronts this idea that American society consciously turns a blind eye to its black members. So a lot of wonderful African American writers came out of the FWP. And one thing that is just utterly fascinating that I want to tell you about really quickly is one of the projects is that the writers took with them these audio folks who had this very crude recording equipment, and they wanted to go into the Deep South and record the aging former slaves who were, really getting on up in years now in the 30s, and they wanted to record their stories firsthand from their mouths before these amazing people passed away. And you can actually go online and hear these former slaves telling their own stories. It is one of the most incredible things I've ever heard in my life. And I believe the site is called Unchained Voices, if memory serves, but look that up. It is just absolutely incredible. So now let's switch gears right quick to that intro to modernism. So again, if you go to course documents and you just click on Introduction to Modernism, you can follow along with me. So we've talked just a bit about it, and this is really going to be our focus now. So what is modernism? It's notoriously difficult to define clearly because it encompasses a lot of all these different specific artistic and philosophical movements of the time, including symbolism, futurism, surrealism, expressionism, imagism, which we're studying, and even things like Dada, which, I'm not very familiar with that, but maybe some of you are, and I know that it's an artistic movement. But to further complicate things, a lot of the modernists, including some of the best ones, most famous ones, aren't affiliated with any of those groups. But there are some basic tenets of modernism that apply in one way or another to all of these movements and writers and artists. And so modernist literature is characterized chiefly by a rejection of 19th century traditions and of their consensus between author and reader. So again, we've got writers who are just saying, I'm breaking away from all these old, outdated ideas of the past in writing, and I'm going to do something new. And we see that again and again and again. And specifically, modernists deliberately tried to break away from the conventions of the Victorian era. So this separation from 19th century literary and artistic principles is a major part of the broader goal. Modernists wanted to distinguish themselves from virtually the entire history of art and literature, which is kind of hard to do. Ezra Pound captured the essence of modernism with his famous dictum, "Make it new." And a lot of modernist writers felt that every story that could possibly be told had, in one form or another, already been told. And that is actually true. If you look back at ancient works of literature, a lot of the stories we tell today are basically using a lot of those same formulas and ideas. So in order to create something new, the modernists often had to try using new forms of writing, new styles of writing. So modernism produced all these experimental, avant-garde sort of styles of writing. And perhaps best known for that experimentation would be James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, to name a few. And we are looking at some of those writers. So the dates of the modernist movement, again, itself a problematic term, as there was in no sense a singular consolidated movement. are sometimes difficult to determine. But the beginning of the 20th century is a convenient starting point. That's why I've emboldened that. If I ask you on a quiz or on the final exam, when was modernism? The beginning of the 20th century, 1900, is a good starting point because it saw the end of Queen Victoria's reign, marking this symbolic break from the preceding century. And it also roughly coincided with the publication of several groundbreaking theories like Freud's interpretation of dreams, Einstein's theory of special relativity. And as such, there were real shifts, not just symbolic changes in the natural sciences, the social sciences, the liberal arts occurring at this time as well. But using the year 1900 as a starting point is also problematic because it excludes some writers and texts from the late 1800s, which definitely show modernist tendencies. And so a lot of scholars use 1890 as the starting point because it's close to the end of Victoria's reign and the end of the century, but it's still fairly inclusive. So it's important to remember, though, that while 1890 is an appropriate starting date, it's also kind of an artificial one. So you could say 1890 or you could say 1900, and you would kind of be right both ways for a starting point of modernism. By convention and convenience, most people use 1945 as the end point for modernism. So if I ask you when did it end, 1945. That marks the end of World War II and this huge shift in world politics as well as in our values socially, culturally, and literary values as well. So just a little bit more on the modern aesthetic. The goal of accomplishing something which artistically speaking had never been done before was often accompanied by a sense of despair, imagine that, due to the inherent difficulty and sometimes impossibility of achieving the goal. So we had a whole bunch of real depressed writers because they were like, dang, I want to do something new, but dadgummit, I can't do it because it's impossible. So that despair coincided with this changing worldview that was filtering through British and a lot of European and American society as well. So the pre-modernist world is characterized by a sense of order, stability, kind of rooted in this meaningful nature of faith, of collective social values, shared values, a clear sense of identity in terms of who we are as Americans and what we believe in, both personal and cultural. But the modernist period is characterized by a sense of chaotic instability rooted in that revelation that collective social values are not especially meaningful to these folks. It's leading to faithlessness, skepticism, and a confused sense of identity both personally and nationally. So kind of a depressing thing. And I emboldened that line there because you want to remember that. If I ask you, can you characterize modernism for me? That's what you would say. It's rooted in this sense of instability and chaos because people are questioning their identity and their values. So this worldview is prominent in much, certainly not all, but much of modernist writing, and perhaps most famously in the fragmented verse of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Now, I love a lot of what T.S. Eliot wrote, and I have placed, as you know, some of his writing in our syllabus, but I hate, as we would say in Eastridge, hate The Wasteland with a passion from a hail. I hate it. And I would never assign it to you because I don't want to torture you and make you want to go jump off of a bridge. And there are many of my colleagues who do not appreciate the fact that I hate The Wasteland. But I hate it. And so it is not on any of my syllabi. So you're welcome. And if you appreciate it, good for you. I'm glad. I do not. If you want to know why I do not appreciate it, you could go and start reading a little bit of it. and you'll be like, I don't know what drug T.S. Eliot was on, but I'm staying away from that, because, yeah. All right, so, so that's modernism, and I'll see you next time around.